When Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out, I didn't see it in theaters. It was a while after it was out before I finally watched it. By then, I had a little bit more indifference to Indiana Jones than I did when I was a kid. Even though I do believe Crystal Skull is a bad movie, though I actually like it more than Temple of Doom, I never had the same hatred for this movie that I did some of Lucas's other movies from this time period. But there's enough here to unpack and decide what works and what doesn't, and ask ourselves why it doesn't work and how it can be fixed. The movie is set in 1957 and has Indiana Jones crossing swords with communists who are looking for a crystal skull, which is actually an alien skull. Along the way, Indy teams up with Shia LaBeouf's character, who we find out is his son by Marion Ravenwood from Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're also looking for Indy's old friend, played by John Hurt, and globetrotting hilarity ensues. I like the idea of moving the franchise into the 1950s. Since 20 years had elapsed since the previous Indiana Jones movie, it makes sense for that much time to have passed for the characters as well. A lot of people were disappointed we didn't have Indy still fighting Nazis in and around World War II, and the only way that would have worked is if you made this movie in the early to mid-90s, which for the purposes of this video is not an option. So the mid-50s, I'm on board. Unlike just about everyone else who hates this movie, I don't hate the idea of doing Aliens, since entertainment in the 1950s was very flying saucer heavy. The previous three films were a mix of what was going on in the pop culture of the 1930s and the real world of the 1930s, to varying degrees of success. So Crystal Skull needs to take advantage of the real world of the 1950s and the pop culture of the 1950s. I think what people didn't like about this was that it felt tonally different from the previous three films. They all had supernatural threats, so they think it's weird that this one has a sci-fi threat. But when you do a sequel almost 20 years later, it's going to be tonally different than the previous film. There's no getting around that. Even though, in theory, I'm on board with Aliens, I was not crazy about the bad guys in this movie. While America was getting passive-aggressive with the Soviet Union in the mid-50s, I don't think the bad guys of the movie had to be communists. There were still plenty of Nazis hiding out in South America at the time, and since this movie hinted that Indy had a working relationship with the CIA, just have Indy be like a punchier version of Ezra Lieberman from The Boys from Brazil. And since the movie spends a good deal of time in South America anyway, this would work fine. Not to mention, historically, Adolf Hitler had a fascination with the occult, so you could say one of the Nazis Indy is hunting was aware of something Hitler had found during the war, and he intends to use this thing to resurrect the Third Reich. Apparently, Harrison Ford thought that Nazis were played out as bad guys, which I don't get. They're in all kinds of movies. They were only in 2 of the Indiana Jones movies, and the previous one was 19 years before Crystal Skull, so I don't see where Ford was coming from. Steven Spielberg didn't want to make light of Nazis after doing Schindler's List, which, yeah, okay, that's a very serious movie, and the Indiana Jones movies, they're meant to be more of the fun popcorn movies. So I can see where Spielberg is coming from. He thinks using Nazis in such a fun entertainment-based movie would trivialize the menace he tried to portray with such gravitas. But what are you saying about the Soviet Union? Joseph Stalin was also pretty bad. Are you saying it's okay to use communists in your silly B-movie send-up, but not Nazis? Despite the real-life atrocities done by Joseph Stalin, for some reason, in fiction, the communists never did become the notorious villains the Nazis have become in books, movies, comics, and TV shows. Maybe they are, and I'm just not seeing them in the stories I'm consuming. But you look at superhero comics, any comic that came out in the 1940s had the hero fight the Nazis. But any superhero comics that existed in the mid-50s to the early 60s, they may have dabbled in replacing the Nazis with the communists as the big evil villains, but it didn't take. For my 2 cents, I'd stick with the Nazis. For whatever reason, in pop culture, they are the go-to villains. And like I said, historically, there were still some of them around in the time period of this movie, so it's not completely unrealistic, which in a movie with crystal alien interdimensional beings, realism is a thing that we should be going for, right? While I don't have a problem with doing more of a sci-fi thing, what they actually did makes no sense at all. There's 13 crystal skulls, and when you put them all together, they make a complete alien, and he creates a wormhole. Who split this alien, and why? Who removed the crystal skull in the first place, and why only remove one? The aliens being extra-dimensional beings was because Spielberg had no interest in doing aliens, so Lucas changed them to compromise, but it's a nonsensical reveal that makes no sense in an entire scene that makes no sense. The aliens should have been more like the Skrulls from Marvel Comics, or the aliens from V, humanoids who are trying to infiltrate Earth, and perhaps a few of them are working with the Nazis Indy is hunting in South America. Their homeworld is in ruins, or is at war, and a few of them left to find a better planet where they could live safely. Some of the aliens are peaceful and want to live out their remaining days on Earth quietly, and a few of them think they can take advantage of the primitives on Earth and live like kings. One of the good aliens can be on Indy's team hunting the Nazis, because he or she knows the bad aliens are helping the Nazis Indy is hunting. And And using human-shaped aliens you can't tell apart from humans might work well if you still want to touch on the Red Menace going on in the 1950s. I wouldn't have the communist feature in the movie, but people at this time couldn't tell if their neighbors could be trusted or not. Maybe Indy is getting orders from Langley that one of his team might be a Red, so watch your back. A nice bit of misdirection there. Making the aliens appear human allows the plot to remain somewhat grounded, like the previous movies. I don't mind shaking things up a little, going sci-fi when the previous movies did mystical stuff, but it's also a good idea to not completely reinvent the wheel. People like the previous movies for a reason, so try to mimic them in ways that works with this sequel. I don't mind Indy having a son and having a difficult relationship with him, much like he had a difficult relationship with his own dad, but I do not like that Indy left Marion at the altar, as that makes him seem irredeemable to me. We now live in a world where people can bring themselves to forgive a dude for pushing a child out a window to cover up his own incestuous infidelity, so maybe I'm putting too much weight on Indy's past sins, but I had trouble getting past this, so I would remove Marion completely and do a surrogate son or daughter type subplot with someone who is helping Indy hunt Nazis. This guy or girl could be right out of training and thinks Indy is just some old fossil, but eventually realizes he or she has stuff that they can learn from him over the course of the movie. And likewise, Indy can be reticent to move forward with the new ways that this agent represents. If you want to have fun with it, this agent could have some kind of James Bondian gadgets, and Indy hates them. Not super out there gadgets, just the same level you would see in the early Sean Connery Bond films. This is fun because Indiana Jones was meant to be a James Bond in a pre-World War II adventure serial send-up, and with this being set at the time when the first Ian Fleming Bond books were coming out, this would work great, like how using the pop cultural tropes of the era is a thing the previous Indy movies did. By the end of the movie, Indy can be willing to step aside and allow younger agents to continue his work he's been doing, or he will be more open to continuing his field work with the younger operative helping him out. I don't mind the idea of an Indiana Jones 5 if you do it like 2 or 3 years after this movie came out. Don't wait 12 years and say you're going to do a 5th movie. No surviving an atomic bomb by hiding in a refrigerator, no swinging on the vines with the monkeys. I'd say Indy is retired from teaching, or is at least taking a semester off during the events of this movie. I get that the previous movies included scenes of him at the university, but it doesn't have to be a thing in every Indiana Jones movie, especially if he is dedicated to hunting down Nazis around the world. I'd want to start the movie with Indy missing an eye, or have him lose an eye at some point during the movie, as a callback to the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. In that series, there were multiple episodes where we got to see absolutely ancient Indy wearing an eye patch. There was even one episode with Harrison Ford playing 1950 Indy, and he had both eyes there, so you could say this is a recent thing. Maybe it ties in with Indy feeling like he's getting too old for this. He lost his eye because he got careless, so maybe this new guy is right, and he needs to step out of the way. As far as the love interest goes, I wouldn't have to have one of those either. Yeah, the previous movies had a different love interest in each movie, keeping with this series being a send-up to James Bond, but Indy's getting older, and I'm getting older too. It wouldn't make as much sense for him to still be a lady killer in his mid-60s. Not saying silver foxes can't get frisky, just saying it's less likely in this scenario, where he's in the middle of South America on a job, wanting to keep his focus on the mission. But speaking of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, absolutely ancient Indy did have an unnamed daughter in one episode, so you could say Indy is married and she's pregnant at home. Might put a little more weight on this younger agent he works with in this movie being a surrogate son or daughter. And apparently Frank Darabont was involved with Crystal Skull at one point and was going to work in an unnamed daughter, but was shot down by the fiend Steven Spielberg. So this way, she's back in canonicity, but she doesn't have to be a part of the story. And that's about it. Like I said, I never disdained this movie as much as some people did, but revisiting it for the purposes of this video, there's very little that I would keep if given the choice to change it. Just the setting and the idea of using some kind of sci-fi MacGuffin are the only things I think work about this movie. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and in the meantime, check out some of my other videos I do around here. Until next time, have a good one.